Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and we want to welcome you to our studios. And with us here, a very special guest and a dear brother, Dan Gibson. And we have started discussing, few of the objections raised against Dan Gibson in one of our earlier series. And today we decided really to talk about claims that Dan Gibson have been refuted, and that's why we're calling this series Refuting Dan Gibson. In fact, I want to add the word really. So we are going to allow Dan to go through a series of possible refutations that people raise against his theory, if you wish, and we want him to have a chance to respond to those claims and present his facts, his data, because at the end of the day, Dan did not just come up with his theory out of thin air. He did a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of practical data collection, visitations, and he have made many of these data available for people even to investigate for themselves, so that they can, go ahead and inspect the data that he's been sharing with them. And of course, we're not against the idea of coming up with a possible refutation, but that doesn't mean when someone will say, I refuted one of Dan Gibson's claim, therefore there goes his entire theory. It doesn't work that way. Now, a theory may have a number of pillars. If you think you have weakened one of them, you still have to deal with the others. And that's where we're coming from. By the way, before I introduce Dan, I just want to mention to you that we're having just a slight technical difficulty with the video, and you may see some flickering, so don't worry, we're aware of it in case someone is thinking it's their computer. We don't want you to go and sell yours and buy another one. So it's something that we are trying to resolve. With that in mind, Dan, welcome back, brother. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Very good. So, Dan, like you and I talked the other day, and you said people sometimes will maybe genuinely or maybe for whatever agenda or ad hominem, maybe they think just because they have a way to answer one of your claims, somehow your entire research is in shambles now, and therefore it doesn't worth the papers written on it. Is that really a fair way to assess that?
Yeah, there are people who are saying that kind of thing. I see it every once in a while on the internet. I think the best way to tackle this is to use an illustration. If we can bring it up on the screen. I mean, I've put a box here, and I'm saying that my research is like this box. We have 170 mosques that we've looked at. This is mosques and places of prayer. This is from the first 3 centuries of Islam, the first 300 years of Islam. So all the data is there. It's trying to find every mosque. We're not picking and choosing every mosque that's there. And what we've discovered is that there were 4 different qiblas used by the Umayyads. And so that is the data, and we get a few questions about it. People ask, what about this mosque or that mosque? Not a lot of questions about the data, but the questions that come, and we'll throw up the next big question mark, is what does this mean? How do we interpret this? And what can we draw out of the data? And so if we move on to the next one, then I've developed my own theory. So after the data is gathered, the question is then, what does it mean? My theory is that it started in Petra, and then eventually 3 other qiblas were developed, so that there were 4 altogether being used during the Umayyad times. The Abbasids came along and changed all that and reduced it down to 1 qibla in one direction, which was Mecca and Saudi Arabia. Now, that's my theory. That's what I developed. But then I developed supporting arguments. So there are around 50-some supporting arguments that support this, looking at Islamic literature, reading through it, looking at what archaeologists are saying and uncovering. And these are different arguments that are for it. Now, sometimes these arguments may sound weak at one point, they may grow. For instance, way back at the beginning, I said, the language used around the city of Petra is very similar to the Quranic language. I had only a few lines, just a couple paragraphs in that. Now, today, a few years later, that has grown. That pillar is very strong because a lot of research is being done. Things are coming out to show that the very language that is used in the city of Petra at the time that Muhammad was around is very similar to the language that was used in the Qur'an. And so there are some real good connections there. So that pillar grew stronger. Others, we may say, okay, that you can look at this different ways. Maybe it's not quite as strong. So each of these pillars, but there's 50 of them, or more than 50. So people may come along and argue with one of those pillars and say, that pillar is weak, that I disagree with that or whatever. But what about all the other supporting pillars? So what happens is I find people coming along and they'll argue with my theory. They will argue with some of the supporting arguments that I make, but they don't tackle the actual data that we've discovered. What we're hoping is that people will come along and explain the data by giving us a different theory. If you disagree with my theory, that's fine, but you need to explain, or people out there need to explain, how did they develop the 4 different qiblas? So it's not just knocking down something small that I said. It's actually, you need to come up with a reason why the archaeology looks like it does.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Dan, because it seemed like it's always, and I've noticed this even at some scholarly level. I don't want to mention names because I don't want people to think I'm picking on specific individuals, but it seemed like the default usually is the standard Islamic narrative, right? So Dan, I refuted one pillar, therefore I'm going to go back now to the fact that it's Mecca. Well, you have to explain to me now, why do we have mosques that build, as you stated, during the Umayyad period, that are facing towards Petra? My goodness, I grew up learning that Umayyads came way after the Rashidun, basically caliphate or the righteous caliphs. Therefore, you would expect by the Umayyads' time that everything is facing towards Mecca. In fact, you would expect it during the Rashidun caliphate or the righteous caliphs that the qiblas at that time will be facing Mecca. But that's not what we're seeing. So it's okay to say Dan is wrong and here is why is wrong in one of these pillars out of the 50, but you have to explain to me the rest of them.
That's right. And we're only just now learning to identify the Rashidun mosques. There's a few of them out there that have survived, and they all face the city of Petra. So how do you explain that? That we can't find a single surviving mosque that faced Mecca in the 1st century of Islam? It's very hard to explain. Other qiblas survive, but there's no surviving Meccan qibla. So, I mean, for me, it's very simple. My theory is actually very simple, and that is the city of Petra in Jordan had multiple names. And we know it was called Al-Beta, it was called Rechem. In Greek, it was known as the mother of all cities, or mother of all settlements. And it also had the name Mecca. We can find references to that and saying that it was called Mecca. So it had multiple names. And so it's all I do is when I go through Al-Tabri or go through Bukhari or any of these, I put a little number 1 or number 2 after the name Mecca. Is it referring to the first location of Mecca, or is it referring to the second location of Mecca? Right. It's just like the people who built the city of York in UK, and then later some of them moved to America, and then they named the new city there New York. So it was also York, but they gave it a new in front. In the Islamic records, there is the first Mecca, and then there is the second Mecca, and that's what's confusing. Is everyone says, well, it all says Mecca, that must refer to Saudi Arabia, when actually there were 2 locations. That's my theory. It's all very simple, and then then the archaeological record then lines up with all the Islamic traditional records that are out there. So it's very simple. It's not complex. I'm not rewriting all of Islam. I'm simply adding a 1 or a 2 after that name. And also with a couple of other places, Taif as well. We've located what we believe is the original Taif according to the descriptions. And so there's a little number 1 or a little number 2, just as outside of New York, you find New Harlem or other places. And so there was a renaming when they moved the rock down to Saudi Arabia. These locations come up again. So it's not complex, I don't think, and I'm not rewriting a lot of history.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for instance, Becca is mentioned in the Quran. Raqim is another term that you hear. So what I'm trying to say, I like your idea of York and New York, Jersey, New Jersey, and you find all of this at least in the eastern, side of the United States when the pilgrims came, and you would, that's expected, because you're emotionally attached to something. And in this case, for political reasons, people were forced to leave, seeking freedom of religion, if you wish, and so on and so forth. So have you looked at, for instance, at least from some of the info that I have, and I haven't really inspected at a deeper level, so I don't want to sound like I am claiming that this is it. It appears that the Shia also have built some shrines for pilgrims, for the pilgrimage, I should say, in the regions. And some of it was prompted by the fact that they didn't want to go all the way to Mecca. They have an alternative sites. Now, that's almost the same as the idea of people moving from Petra down to Mecca for whatever reason. It could have been religious reasons, could have been political reasons, and now they wanted to restart all over again with something that they are emotionally attached to.
Yes, and I think at that point, that's why these alternative qiblas came up, and that's where going to different places for pilgrimage or for just to go there where there are holy shrines or whatever. This came up in the Umayyad time, and so you have a totally different thing happening in North Africa than was happening in the Middle East. And so it weakened the whole thing. That's why I think the Abbasids were really successful in taking over Islam and reestablishing the order. The Abbasids all say the Umayyads were terrible, and a lot of people haven't really looked to see what was terrible. If you look back at it, this whole theory explains how terrible the Umayyads were during their time in just not controlling the development of Islam, and it really got all out of hand during Umayyad times.
Wonderful, wonderful. And this is, you really demonstrated in a very simple way why most arguments, fail, at least fail in refuting the big picture claim and data that you have presented. So what are we to talk about next time when we meet?
Next time, I want to talk about, can two theories exist based on the same data? Is that possible? Or does the data just refute something else? So we'll have a look at that idea next.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dan. And again, hopefully everyone have enjoyed this opening show of this series that we have called Refuting Dan Gibson, with a question mark, of course. And we're going to let Dan and his data do the work for us. Again, we're not against the idea of people doing their best to try to respond to any of these claims. After all, that's the field of academia. We encourage things like this, but to use an ad hominem, approach, or to try just to make a bogus claim, a fallacy, and say, "Oh, I refuted one of his claims, therefore all of his claims are wrong." It doesn't work this way. You have to deal with them one by one, simply because Dan's theory is based on factual data that anyone can go and inspect. So he did not really dream up these things, because he felt like it, or he emotionally tried to argue against the qibla just because he has an agenda. Not at all. I mean, I've known Dan for a long time. He doesn't have any agenda. He's just trying to be a researcher, an archaeologist, someone that is revealing data. And we're so thankful that he's not hoarding the data to himself, as some academicians do, by the way. They find something, they keep it to themselves or within their circle. Dan is making it available for people. In fact, he never really said, I'm making it available because I expect you to reach this conclusion. And as a result of this conclusion, I expect you to make this decision, and so on and so forth. I am the one that I'm going to tell you now, if you're a Muslim watching this, do your homework. You are a smart person. Don't rely on people telling you we refuted Dan. Go and check and inspect these data yourself. You can even go to Petra yourself. Go there and take a look at some of the things happening there. Buy his book, or let us know how we can get you a copy, and go and inspect each one of these mosques, and then make a decision related to your salvation. That's where I'm coming from, because we grew up believing that this is the location, the origin of Islam. That's the qibla direction. Mecca is where everything started. But now I'm asking you to go and inspect these damaging new finds based on factual data, versus the standard Islamic narrative has no data whatsoever to support it, because if you rely on Islamic sources, you have to wait 200 years before everything fit together. With that in mind, we want to thank everyone for watching, and we look forward to seeing you folks next time. Blessings to all of you. Take care. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, CIRA International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.